If this is your first time, I would love to ask for one simple thing. As you leave, there's a connection card in the seat in front of you. If you could just fill that out and then just drop it in the black offering boxes as you leave. We'd love to connect with you this week and be able to celebrate your being here with us. And we would love to just be able to reach out to you this next week. You know, this last week, I had a really good week, and as you know, I've been telling you a little bit about my flag football team. And we had our flag football game on Saturday, and we won our first 2 preseason games, and we were rolling. It was like, yes, this is what our team should look like, and it was going so good. And then we got into the regular season. Why are you guys laughing at me already? We started, and now our season, we are 0 wins and 3 losses. I know, I cannot, we have gotten beat. The first 2, I really think were because of the refs. This last one, they outplayed us in every conceivable. They were an amazing team. There we go, big round of applause. That way, I can see your beautiful faces. They absolutely destroyed us. And I don't know about you, but I am a very competitive person. I do not like to lose. Anybody else? You do not like to lose? Can you just, all right, Eddie back there, hand went right up. Okay, we got some hands over here. Like Brian, like losing no bueno, right? I do not like to, it doesn't matter what it is, church. Like flag football, video games, playing cribbage, playing rummy. It doesn't matter what the game is. It doesn't matter what area of life that I feel like I'm losing in. I cannot stand to lose. And so some of you can identify with the others. You're like, win, lose, it's just fun in the process. I can't even identify with that. I don't even understand that mentality. That is so distant for me. But you know what? When you lose, it hurts. It's humbling to walk off that football field and be like, man, I'm coaching these kids and now they're 0-3. When you lose, it can cost you something. Maybe it costs you your reputation. Maybe it costs you something else. When you lose, sometimes it can really create this angst or this depression or this feeling of inferiority, and it can really impact us. And the reality is some of us walked in today not feeling like we lost a flag football game, but right now feeling like we're losing at life. Feeling like things aren't going the way we wanted to, that things aren't happening in the legacy of our family the way we wanted and hoped and dreamed. Feeling like something's happening inside of our body and our health, and we feel like we're being defeated. We're losing. Maybe it was hard for you even to get up and to come to church today. Maybe it was hard for you to log into NBC Online because right now you feel defeated. This is the perfect place for you. This is a loving place for you. This is a welcoming place. You matter to God in this place. And today we're going to take a look at some other people that were completely and totally defeated. They were defeated to the point where they had become completely enslaved. This wasn't just something that they were experiencing. It was impacting every aspect of their life. They were living in Egypt as slaves, being forced to do whatever the Pharaoh told them to do, with no hope of a future, with no rights. You see, the Israelites, the Hebrew people, were in Egypt in slavery and in bondage to Pharaoh. And so if you walked in today, if you're watching right now on YouTube, and you feel defeated, I hope you can identify and connect with their plight and their story. But we're going to move today from defeat to victory. Let's pray. God, I'm here and I'm asking that no matter what each person came to with service today, whether they're celebrating blessings and they're celebrating things going in their life that they're just praising you for, or they walked in today and they're feeling discouraged or defeated. That God, today as we take a look at who you are, that we would begin to move from defeat to victory. It's in your name we pray. Amen. In the series Legacy, what we've been doing is we've been going through Hebrews chapter 11. And Hebrews chapter 11 carries all of these stories of all the heroes of the faith, looking back at the Old Testament and telling us how did they demonstrate their faith. And so by seeing how they demonstrate their faith, we can relate to that, and we too can learn to live a life of faith and build a legacy of faith. And so open up your Bibles with me. We're going to open up to Hebrews chapter 11. If you have a physical Bible, you can open that up. It's going to be in the New Testament. If you don't have a physical Bible, that's totally good. Open up your phone, download the YouVersion Bible app. You can follow along right there in Hebrews 11, or you'll be able to follow along right on the screen. Today we're going to come to a person. And the story sets off with the nation of Israel, the Hebrew people, in complete slavery and bondage to the Egyptians. But they've been growing as a people. Their numbers have been growing, their power has been growing, their influence has been growing. But remember, they're in slavery, they're in bondage, and Pharaoh sees this, and he's like, no. I'm not losing my workforce. I'm not losing this nation that's making me wealthy and powerful. And he sees that as their nation is growing, as God is blessing them, he sees that he's going to have to do something drastic. And so the Pharaoh says, every Hebrew-born child, when they are born, will be killed. The midwives will kill them, or they will be tossed in the Nile River. I cannot imagine, as a parent who's expecting a coming child, to know that is the decree. To know that when my son is born, that he is going to be killed, murdered. And that's where we see the faith begin. Hebrews 11:23, it says this, it was by faith. Church, you got to underline that today, okay? If you have a physical Bible, we're going to see that phrase, it was by faith, over and over and over. And so we're in a series talking about building a legacy of faith. So I want us to underline that so that you can see the consistency in the author's message. It says this, it was by faith that Moses, this is who we're going to be looking at the life of, the man Moses. But we're not looking in this verse at his life. Let's look at what it says next. It was by faith that Moses' parents, Amram and Jochebed, they hid him for 3 months when he was born. They take their own life into their own hands. They say, we're going to take this baby, this 3-month-old baby boy, and we are not going to turn him over to be killed. We are going to hide the fact that he was born, putting themselves at risk, putting Moses at risk. It continues on. They saw that God had given them an unusual child. Now, I don't know if any of you, when your child was born, you looked at me like, no, that's an unusual child. It's not saying it like a bad way. It's not like, whoa, this kid looks a little different. No, it's saying in this beautiful, powerful way that Amram and Jochebed, they looked at Moses and they said, there is a calling on this baby's life. There is something significant that God is going to do. This whole series we've been talking about as parents, how we want to pass on our legacy to their children. They look at Moses and they say, there's something unusual. We're going to risk our life. We're going to risk everything to protect this baby. And they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. What I want us to see in this first section here is a legacy of faith requires risk, or involves risk. A legacy of faith involves risk. Amram and Jochebed, they risked keeping Moses for the first 3 months. Then they risk putting Moses in the Nile River and allowing him to float away. They took risks because of their faith. They believed that God would protect them. They believed that God had a calling, a purpose for their unusual child, their baby boy. They were risking their lives to honor God because they could see the calling on their child's life. What risk are we taking to honor God and to build a legacy of faith? Are we willing to risk the promotion that we just received? To say, you know what, this isn't going to better my family. This isn't going to better my marriage. This isn't going to better my relationship with God. I'm willing to risk right now my career to say, I'm going to honor God? Are we willing to risk it? Are we willing to risk our financial security? To say, you know what, I'm going to use my resources to represent Jesus inside of the world in a powerful and significant way. And so I'm going to step out of my comfort zone and I'm going to live a risky faith, saying God can do infinitely more with what I put in his hands than what I keep in my hands. Are we willing to live a risky faith? Are we willing to live a risky faith, saying, you know what, not everyone's going to agree with me. I'm going to choose to love people like Jesus tells me to love people. And by loving people, there may be some people that no longer see me as living the way they would aspire to live. Because I'm going to love God and I am going to love others. To risk our reputation. You see, this is what Jochebed and Amram do. See, sometimes in life it feels like we should just go with the flow. Just blend in. But if we want to build a legacy of faith, we have to be willing to take risks. As they take that risk, the Pharaoh's daughter comes and finds baby Moses and brings her into her household to become a prince. He becomes part of the royal family. How incredible that God honors Moses' parents' faith. Not only does he preserve Moses' life, but he elevates Moses' life from living with the Hebrew Israelite people to say, I'm going to put your son inside of the royal family. I'm going to allow him to experience blessings and power and influence like no one else. But how does Moses respond? Well, we can see right next. It says this in verse 24 through 26. Underline it, church, right here. It was by faith. When he grew up, as Moses becomes a man, this is how he demonstrates his faith. It says he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter raised him, but Moses doesn't take on that title. He doesn't say, I'm going to take on this title of prince and Pharaoh's son. He chose to share the oppression of God's people. Read right there. We started at the beginning talking about what? A defeated people, an enslaved people. It says he chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. When you're in royalty, can you imagine what's available to you? Can you imagine the sin that was available to Moses? Can you imagine the pride and the selfishness that could grow up in the heart of someone who's in royalty? It says he forsakes those things. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. First, we saw a legacy of faith involves risk. Secondly, a legacy of faith refuses to compromise. Pharaoh has this baby boy that is growing up in his household as a prince, Moses. Can you imagine how hard Pharaoh would try to indoctrinate Moses? Can you imagine how much his mom, the princess, would to embrace the culture of Egypt, to embrace his position as royalty? Can you imagine the temptation to say, you know what, you've got it rough, I've got a really good life, God put me here, I'm going to embrace all of this pleasure and opulence. Instead, Moses rejects those things. See, the reality is, Satan is working to deceive us as well. Sometimes he's sending things into our life because he wants you to get your identity connected to what he has sent. Oh, but this is a blessing from God. This resources, these are blessings from God that I'm supposed to use for me and for my putting forward and my goals and my pleasure. This relationship has to be from God. You see, sometimes Satan says, you know what, I'm going to send someone, I'm going to send something, I'm going to send an opportunity. And I want it to divert your focus from God and his plans and purposes for your life and onto that object or onto that thing. Other times, when we experience the tension, we experience it kind of like Moses did here. Moses had everything in his life that would have caused him to put faith inside of his position as a prince. But instead, he says, no, I'm going to experience resistance. Many athletes, and even when you get into physical therapy, what they do is they will use resistance. They'll use resistance bands. We were just talking about this morning on the patio, right? And so when we experience resistance, this is what Moses was experiencing. He had the Pharaoh. He had his adopted mom. He had all of his friend group that would have said, no, you need to adapt. You need to change. You need to conform. And Moses says, no. I'm not going to compromise who I am and the calling God has in my life. And so every time he did that, he experienced resistance. The battery on my pack's dead, so I don't think it's going to come on, is it? Oh, it's on. Beautiful. We good? Oh, look at that. Give him a big round of applause. NBC Online can't hear me, and you all can. Sometimes in life, what we do is we experience resistance. And we're like, I don't want resistance. I just want an easy life. I just want to be able to smooth sail. I just want to be able to do whatever. But God says, no, I'm going to introduce into your life, I'm going to introduce some resistance. And when you experience that resistance, what's the purpose of that inside of your life and mine sometimes? Sometimes the purpose of that is to build our faith. Moses could have just simply walked the simple path and said, I'm going to live like Egyptian royalty. But instead, he refused to compromise. Every morning when he woke up, every classroom experience, every point of life, he's experiencing this resistance. And every time he had to make that decision to refuse to compromise, he had to begin to develop his muscle. Yes. To say, God, I am going to be committed to you. I am going to build my faith. And so if you're here today and you could say, I am honoring God, maybe you're experiencing resistance to build your faith. But the only way that we can build our faith while experiencing that resistance is if we remain focused on God. This is what it says. It says inside it was by faith, underline it, that Moses left the land of Egypt. Well, why would Moses leave the land of Egypt? Well, one day, Moses sees an Egyptian that's mistreating some Hebrews, and so he goes and he kills the Egyptian. He thinks it was done in secret, but it wasn't. Word begins to get out, and so immediately the Pharaoh finds out about it, and Moses has to flee. But as he flees, he remains focused on God. Watch this. This is what it says. He kept right on going, because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. Moses is fleeing for his life. But as he runs, he's keeping his eyes, his focus on the invisible. Did Moses realize, man, I really just messed up? I don't know. Did Moses realize that this was a time of preparation for him as he was heading out into the wilderness? I don't know. It doesn't explain what it was exactly that God was doing in his life, but it does explain that as he experienced this difficulty, this defeat personally and also in front of the eyes of his family, in front of the eyes of the Israelites and Hebrew people, it says that he remained focused on God. Maybe today you don't know the purpose of what you're experiencing. The first week of the series, we read the first verse of Hebrews chapter 11. And it reminds us of this importance of focusing on God. This is what it said in Hebrews 11:1. It says, faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It shows us what we're dreaming and we're aspiring, what we believe God can do in our legacy of faith. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. As Moses flees into the wilderness, he doesn't know if this is the end or what there is going to be ahead. Sometimes when we're in a situation, we kind of operate like this. And all I could see is my hand. And it just needs to shift just a little bit. So my focus goes from my hand to what God is doing. Maybe today one of us needs to come to this position where we take this shift from our current reality, our current situation, our current relationship, our current finances, our current health, and we allow God to shift it just slightly so that we can see His plan, His purpose, the invisible things that He's doing. And church, it's terrifying. I think back at some of the biggest decisions we've made in our life. Many times when we made those decisions, if we were only focused on the immediate circumstances in front of us, we would have been paralyzed. We would have been defeated. We would have given up. We would have walked away. I think of it in our foster care journey. I think of it in God's moving us from the West Valley to join you and to be part of NBC and to move over here to the East Valley. I think of so many situations from my childhood to my teenage years to my adult years to my married life where if all I could see was what was directly in front of me, I would have felt completely defeated and out of control. Maybe today God wants to shift your focus in the same way that as Moses is fleeing the most powerful man in his life, the Pharaoh, he keeps his focus on the invisible God. Get this, church. When we focus on the visible, it's an expression of believing I'm in control. When we constantly check something, that's an indication that we're feeling like we're in control of it. Constantly checking the news, constantly checking our bank account, constantly checking our children's grades, constantly checking for the newest report from our health. When we constantly check something, it can be an indication that we feel like we are in control. But when we focus on the invisible, watch this. When we focus on the invisible, we are reminded that God is the one who's in control of the visible. Rather than my clinging to it, I go to the one who has the only ability to know what the future holds, to be able to change the outcome of another person's heart, to be able to change my situation or my health. We have to shift from focusing on our current reality to saying, I'm going to focus on the invisible God. I am going to trust the invisible God. And that's exactly what Moses models for us. It is by faith that Moses remains focused on what God is doing. It's the faith in the invisible that is our protection. Because God comes to Moses in that wilderness and through a burning bush, he says, I'm going to use you to liberate and to free my people. I am. Go and tell them that I am coming to deliver them. And Moses returns to the Pharaoh. And as he returns to the Pharaoh, he begins to represent God not only to his people, but to the Pharaoh. And there are these plagues that begin to take place. And there's the water that is turned into blood, and the frogs, and the lice, and the flies, and the livestock, and the boils, and the hail, and the locusts, and the darkness. Time after time, pointing to the invisible God who's becoming visible, who's representing his power to the entire nation and to his people. A legacy of faith requires risk, refuses compromise, remains focused on the invisible. And the amazing thing is that as God works, we can see that demonstrated in greater ways. Watch this in verse 28, church. Look at this. It says this, it was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover. Now, we're not going to be able to go into all the details of what Passover is, but I would encourage you to read what the Passover was and is, and it's something that's been continued on, and we talk about a legacy, a generational thing that's been passed on. It's something that's been passed on year after year after year, and so I would encourage you to go look at it, but this is when it's instituted, and he says this, that they are to keep the Passover, and they are to sprinkle blood on the doorposts so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn son. A legacy of faith is for our protection. Moses comes and he instructs them and he tells them to do something that probably in that moment didn't make complete sense. But they had seen God moving. They had seen the miracles. And now Moses says, it is for your protection, the protection of your firstborn son, that you must focus on God, you must be obedient to him, and you must paint blood on your doorposts. And that night the angel came, and the firstborns of the Egyptians were destroyed and killed. But the protection was available to God's people through their faith. When we live life God's way, when we honor him, there is incredible protection. However, God is not only wanting to give you and I protection, but he's wanting to give us victory as well. You see, a legacy of faith is victorious. Watch this, church. As that happens, it says in verse 29, the Pharaoh, he sends all of the Israelites and the Hebrews and he tells them, you need to leave, you need to go, get out of here. And as they leave and they receive their freedom, as they begin to come back to Canaan, verse 29 picks up the story. It says, it was by faith that the people of Israel went right through the Red Sea. What had happened was as they had left, they had come to this natural landmark where they could not get by. The Egyptians and the Pharaoh and his armies are pressing from behind, and God miraculously parts the Red Sea, and he says, I have made a way for you to experience my protection. But get this, as they walk confidently in faith, as they cross over, so do the armies of the Pharaoh. They both have confidence. One is in God, and the other is in their own military might, is in their own chariots. But check out what it says right here in verse 29. The Israelites cross over. The Egyptians tried to follow. Underline it. They were all drowned. You see, a legacy of faith is victorious. God says, I have a plan in place not only for your deliverance, not only for your protection, but for you to experience victory in your life. It started in a legacy of faith by the parents saying, we're going to take a risk. But by saying, we're going to protect Moses. It continued as Moses chose, and he said, okay, I'm not going to compromise. It continued from there when he said, okay, I'm going to focus on God, even as I flee in the invisible, that he has a plan. See, these steps that took place in Moses' life, as we look at this and it says, it was by faith, it was by faith, it was by faith. God was writing the story that was pointing to the victory that God had, that he was going to deliver the entire Israelite people through Moses. God was their source of protection and victory. To be victorious in life, we must put our faith in the one who is in control. But the challenge is each and every one of us, we have a battle going on inside of us. This battle is with something called sin. Our flesh says, no, I want to do life my way. I want to live with my own emotions being the driving factor, my own logic being the driving factor. I'm going to live however I want, proud, selfish, angry. I'm going to hurt who I want. I'm going to take justice at my own hand. And see, this sin in our life separates us from God. And God sees the brokenness that you and I have experienced, and he says, I want to give you victory over that brokenness. And so God said, I'm going to send not Moses, but my own son. I'm going to send Jesus to die on the cross for you and for me. Jesus left the perfection of heaven to come down to earth, to pay the price, to die on the cross for your sin and mine, so we could receive his forgiveness for all of the brokenness and sin in your life. and mine. So today, if you want to experience victory in your life, the first step is to receive that forgiveness from God. To say, God, will you forgive me for the way I've lived my life? I will put my faith and trust in Jesus Christ, in He and He alone. If you've never done that, I want to just give you that invitation right now in your seat to begin to experience the life God intended for you. To have victory over sin and death and the grave, and to be able to spend eternity with God, a God who loves you forever in heaven. God can feel every emotion you're feeling. He can hear your thoughts. And so right there in your seat, right there in your living room, you can have that conversation with God and ask Him to forgive you and place your faith and trust in Him. If you're here in the building, I would love for you, if you're making that decision, just take that same card I talked about earlier, and you can mark on there, I began a relationship with Jesus. We would love to know that and celebrate that with you. But at the beginning, I talked about some of us who came in, and maybe you already have a relationship with God, but you still feel defeated. You feel like you just want to give up. You no longer want to experience all of this pain and evil and brokenness. You see, in this life, brokenness and evil and pain are going to be a constant. Sometimes it has nothing to do with our decisions, but it has to do with the fallen nature of the world that we live in. And so if you're here today and you feel defeated, I just want you to know we love you and we're praying with you. This is a place where you can find friends and family that will walk through the difficulties of life with you. But I want you to know that your faith in God may create a legacy, not just in this life, but in eternity. That as you walk through the brokenness and the pain, that you have a God that knows every detail of your life, who's powerful and who's present. And I want to show you something very unique that took place in this portion of the Bible as we look back in Exodus. Because see, when God called Moses to go back and to free his people, he appeared in the burning bush. And Moses asked him a very important question, and it's a question that each one of us have to decide today. And it's the question of, who do we say that God is? Moses says, well, who should I tell them that sent me? And God gave him a very specific name. And it's a name that if you feel defeated today, I want you to cling to. Because as we went through this story, as Moses was there in the desert, as Moses returns and he's declaring the plagues, as he's telling them what to do, he's using this same name again and again and again, because it's building confidence in the Israelite people, because it is pointing towards what God wants to do, and that name is the name Yahweh. This name of God, Yahweh, means the self-existing one. Yahweh, God did not come from anything. He was self-existing. It points to the all-powerful one. It points for the people of Israel as they are leaving Egypt as the one who will be their deliverer, who will be their provider, who will be their protector. So as Moses is declaring, he's saying, Yahweh, Yahweh. He is reminding them who God is, refocusing them, and telling them that they have a God who is able, a God who is I am. And so, church, today, I think some of us, we just need that reminder. We need that reminder of who God is. And so we're going to wrap up service in just a moment, but normally to wrap up service, I'll give you a challenge. And I'll say, all right, church, this is what we're going to go out and this is what we're going to do. I'll give you something, and I'll say, this is where we're going to take, and we're going to impact our life, and we're going to walk in faith. But today is going to be a little bit different. Because for some of us today, we don't need to do something different. We need to be reminded that a legacy of faith requires us to live differently. But a legacy of faith is all about God. It's all about Yahweh. That no matter what the outcomes, no matter what difficulty we face, whether our circumstances change today or whether our life is made whole and perfect in eternity, it is all about God's plans and God's purpose in your life and mine. That we serve a God who is our protector and who is victorious. And so for some of us, you're walking through something with your health, and it may not turn around. It may continue to decline, and for you today, I want you to be reminded that you have a God that loves you and cares about you and who has created a place, a home in heaven where you will no longer experience pain or sorrow or difficulty. We're going to believe and we're going to ask for your healing, but I want you to have confidence in a God that loves you and knows you. For the person whose relationships are falling apart, I want you to be reminded that God knows every detail of that relationship. And that as you turn to Him and you put your focus on Him, as you begin honoring Him in your life, that God is going to be working in your life. And so the worship team is going to be singing a song. And this song really talks about who God is and what God desires to do in your life, in mine. So for this time, just sit in your seats. You don't need to stand up. Don't need to raise your hand. I would ask you not to leave because someone in your row might be having a time with God and they need to be able to focus. So just take this time and in prayer, ask God to come into your life and to build the spiritual legacy He intends. That you would be able to refuse compromise, focus on Him, experience His protection and victory. Once the song is done, I'm going to come back up and I'm going to pray God's blessing and favor over all of us as we leave.